Welcome to the March Science Under the Stars event. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you have been to SUTS before? How many of you have never been to SUTS before? Okay, a couple of you. Okay, welcome. So before we start, I want to quickly introduce Jason, who is the Brackenridge Field Lab manager. And Jason has been super helpful with all of the Science Under the Stars management. And he's been sponsoring a lot of our merchandise, a lot of the light equipment has been purchased by Jason. And yeah, so let's give it up to Jason.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Brackenridge Field Lab. Excited to have you. If you just went on our tour, you will have seen some of what we do. We host researchers in various capacities. It's an 82-acre property here. And there's an interesting land use history, and a lot of it ties into the history of Austin really nicely. So if you guys come next time to the event next month, we'll talk about the history of BFL. Get a sense of what that looks like. But I appreciate you coming, and I appreciate you dealing with our construction here. We're going through a roof replacement that might end my life. Stress that's putting me through. So, okay. Well, without further ado, I'm going to pass this off to Fiona.
No, not even a little bit?
Microphone close to your mouth.
How about now? Is that better?
Yes.
A little bit more. Okay, let's go with that. Hi. So I'm Fiona. I'm a sixth-year PhD student here at UT. And I am interested in chemistry, insect interactions. And today I'm going to be talking to you about picking your poison, how plant chemical traits defend against herbivores, attract pollinators, and influence toxic butterflies. So I did not grow up in Texas. I'm originally from Massachusetts, and I spent most of my life up in the Northeast. And it's a really different landscape to here. So a lot of the year, it looks like this. This is me and my dad in the early 2000s. It's super cold, it's really snowy, and there's not many plants around. And the plants that are around are kind of sad. So plants were not really at the front of my mind as a kid. But I loved insects. This was my favorite animal as a kid. This is the Cecropia moth. And you can't really tell from the picture, but this is a huge moth. And it's very bright and colorful. This is the adult stage, this is the caterpillar stage, and I thought these guys were incredible. I thought they were beautiful and fascinating. Like this? Oh.
Yeah, right on your chin.
All right, let's go with it. So this is the monarch. This might be more familiar to some of us. We get this guy out here in Austin. And this is a swallowtail, and all of these caterpillars I was really taken with. I thought they were really incredible, and here we can see the adult forms. So into my teens, I stayed really interested in insects. I became a camp counselor. I worked at farm camps and garden camps, and I started thinking about these animals in the context of being herbivores and pollinators and sort of functioning in relationships to plants and other things. So when it came time to go to college, I decided to study that. So in college, I did research on the Colorado potato beetle, which as the adult, it's what we think of as a beetle. They're kind of crunchy, they have those hard shells. But when they're little, they're soft-bodied like this. And they sit and they eat potatoes, they're agricultural pests. And I was doing work on them with predator-prey interactions. So I'd set up stuff like this here. Oh, you can't see. I'd set up stuff like this here, that's potato leaves that I've cut, and I'd add a tiny little beetle to the leaf, and I'd give it a predator smell and see if it ate differently when it had that smell. And so the predator we were interested in is a stink bug. This is the spined soldier bug. And you may not think of these guys as being predators, but they're actually very scary if you're a tiny, soft-bodied insect. So these guys have these little straw mouth parts that they can come and they can stick into soft-bodied insects. And when I was making their smell cue, we'd take and we'd mix this synthetic pheromone. So this is a picture of what smell dispensers look like. They kind of look like eraser tips. And we'd take them and add just a little bit of synthetic smell and then see how the beetle responded. And for me, this is really when I started to think about chemistry as something that's really important in a big way that lots of insects especially engage with the world. I also got the chance during college to work with some pollinators. Here we go. So here's some pollinators that I got to work with. And as I was spending all of this time watching insects, I'm noticing insects are spending a lot of their time on plants. And so I became more curious about what's going on with plant traits, like what's happening on that side of things. And so when it came time to do my PhD, I moved down here to Austin to study that. Let's see, there we go. So I came down here to work with Brian Cedio. Brian studies plant chemistry. He's interested in tropical forests and how the different chemicals that plants produce there can affect their relationships. But I still loved insects and I wanted to keep working with them, and so I'm very lucky to also work with Larry Gilbert and Felicity Muth. Larry is an expert in Heliconius and Passiflora, and if you were on the tour, we saw some of those butterflies really briefly at the beginning. Felicity is interested in behavior and learning of pollinators, and so by working with my 3 advisors, I'm able to kind of keep all of my interests alive. So when we do plant chemistry, we make these extracts, and it's kind of like making tea. So we take a leaf, we dry it out, we grind it up, and we put it in a solvent, and it looks like that. The leaves are green, not everything's green, but from there, this can be used to do chemistry. And these are some photos of salvia plants that I've worked on. These guys are associated with different types of pollinators, so different kinds of animals visit them. And these are some photos of the butterfly caterpillars that we saw in there. This guy here, flapping her wings, that's Heliconius doris. This is one of my favorites. And so during my PhD, I really kind of shifted from thinking about just insects to plant-insect interactions, what's going on with the relationships between these different things. And I want to talk to you about that today and some chemical examples where chemistry is really meaningful and how these things interact with each other. But before we do that, let's think more generally about some differences between plants and animals. Specifically, how are animals protecting themselves and avoiding being eaten? Like, can anyone think of a way? Just shout it out.
Camouflage.
Camouflage? Okay. Others? Sting. Did I hear sting? Sting's a good one. Any others? Biting? Biting is a good one. Yeah, there's lots of different ways. So camouflage for sure. We can have physical defense, things like spines on an animal. They still do chemical defense. If we think of like a venomous snake or a poison frog, those guys are protecting themselves with chemistry. And they have lots of behaviors that help them, right? So they can avoid getting eaten by running away or hissing, maybe they're biting. There's lots of ways that animals protect themselves. But plants, they have roots in the ground, right? So they don't have access to all of these different ways to protect themselves. They have to do a couple less things. But the things they do, they invest really heavily in, and they do a lot with them. So for example, plants can defend them physically with things like thorns, and they can protect themselves chemically with things like poison berries and leaves. And just to kind of sum it up, being rooted in place limits the defensive strategies, and it does something else. It also makes them rely on other types of animals or organisms to help them in their environments and in their relationships. So let's think about who plants are interacting with in the environment. Okay, if we have a plant here, right, we've got some leaves, we've got some flowers, we've got some fruits. It's possible that the leaves will be eaten by herbivores, or maybe there will be a fungal infection on the leaves. And these are plant enemies. These are antagonistic interactions that the plant's going to try to do everything it can to protect itself against. They're trying to avoid these things. At the same time, there's going to be pollinators visiting the flower, helping pollen move place to place so flowers can reproduce. And there's going to be seed dispersers who are picking those fruits and carrying them to new places so that the new individuals don't just all build up right below the parents, but can actually go somewhere else. And these are friends. These are mutualists that plants are going to want to maintain their relationships with and kind of attract to come visit the plant. And while all of this is happening, there's competition with other plants, right? If you're stuck where you are, there's limited resources, there's limited water, there's limited sun, and so there's an element of direct competition between plants and the environment. All of these relationships can be affected by chemistry, and a chemical that affects one relationship in one way can have another effect on another relationship in a different way. So, okay, what's a chemical trait? Like, I keep throwing around that word, plant chemistry. Do we use plant chemicals? Is this something people care about? Does anybody think of something? What was it? You can shout it out, yeah. Is there a plant chemical that you care about?
Nicotine.
Nicotine, caffeine. Yeah, I think caffeine is a huge one, right? Lots of people find like this helps them wake up in the morning. Another one might be capsaicin. This is the compound that gives peppers their spice, and so people really love this. There's lots of ways that we use plant chemistry in our food and our cooking, but there's other ways we use it too. So they can have medicinal properties, be used for things like painkillers or to treat heart problems. They can have anti-inflammatory properties, and they can be used to help with relaxation or sleep or treat minor skin abrasions and cuts. So there's lots of ways that plant chemicals help us on a regular basis. There's lots of reasons that we benefit from these. So why are plants making so many? Like why if they just need one, is that not enough? There's lots of different threats in their environment, right? So we talked about a couple. We said, oh, there could be pathogens infecting them, or oh, maybe there's insect herbivores eating the leaves, but those aren't the only kind of herbivores there are. There are things like deer that can eat the leaves, rabbits could eat the leaves, goats. So all of these larger animals that are coming and visiting plants, they're still eating that tissue, and so that plant is still going to be trying to make ways to be like, hey, don't eat me, like, stop. And importantly, herbivores can only eat plants they can detoxify. So to detoxify means if the plant is making some chemical to protect itself, and an insect or an herbivore is eating there anyway, it's got some immunity to that toxin. It's either got a way to get rid of it, or maybe it's just not sensitive to it, but in some way it's not being harmed by that. It's able to stay there. So let's imagine that we have a community of a bunch of different kinds of plants, and there's a little insect in the middle of it, okay? Let's say all of these are okay food. All of these are safe. And then one of them evolves a toxin where the insect can't eat that one anymore. Now it's toxic to them. It hurts them if they go there. We'll make it a different color so it's easier to see. Over time, as that plant doesn't get eaten as much, it survives better, it's going to perform better, maybe it makes more fruits and more seeds, we might expect this plant to become more common throughout the population and kind of perform better overall, become more abundant. But there's not just one herbivore in the environment. There's lots of different things. And so plants are simultaneously involving lots of different ways to protect themselves from everything. And once an herbivore can come up with a way to detoxify something, that tends to be the spot that they stick. If we think about this plant from before that maybe got more abundant from not being eaten, if something figures out how to eat there, that's a really big resource that they don't have to share with anyone anymore. So they'll form these really specialized relationships between plants and herbivores where plants successfully defend themselves against most things, and herbivores only eat a couple kind of things, and you see this kind of like tight-knit thing. But it's still better for the plant to not be eaten at all, so they'll continue to try to evolve new ways to get rid of their specialists and get everybody away eating their tissue, and that's part of why we see such chemical complexity among plants, where a single leaf can have dozens to hundreds of secondary metabolites in them, or little chemical compounds that we're interested in. So why do they do anything to humans, though? Like, if a plant makes caffeine so that a beetle can't eat it, why does that do anything to me and my body, right? Sometimes the chemical structures can act on the bodies of lots of different kinds of animals, so they're important in lots of different contexts. So if we imagine our bodies a little bit scaled in and think about cells and membranes, we're going to have lots of things like enzymes and receptors and lots of mechanisms that are really specific in the way that they work. And it's almost like a lock and key in our body. And so if we think about chemical structure for a second, I'm going to place 4 plant chemicals up on the screen. If I was to ask you guys which of these is the most similar, do you feel like you have a guess? Okay, how many people guessed this? Did you get that? Yeah, so this is caffeine and theobromine. Caffeine comes from coffee, of course, and then theobromine comes from chocolate. And we can see that these are really structurally similar. They just differ by one little group up there in the top left on caffeine. And these have similar effects on the body, right? They're stimulants, they can kind of give us the feeling of being energized. And so there's this relationship between the structure and the function of chemicals, and depending on what function it affects in the body, it might be something that's shared among lots of kinds of animals, or something that's really specific to just 1 or 2 kinds of things. So these broadly acting chemicals that affect lots of types of different things can include really, really toxic things that plants make. And I want to tell you about a place. I've never been here. I would love to go. This place is called the Poison Garden. And the Poison Garden is based in the UK. It has over 90 species of poison plants. And if you can't read those signs, it says these plants can kill. So some poison plants are just unpleasant. Maybe they make you feel sick, but some are super dangerous. And I want to show you a video now of a tour that they do of some of the plants they maintain there. Can you hear that?
A trope of belladonna will kill you. Datura will put you to sleep forever. Aconitum will kill you. Laurel will produce cyanide and kill you. Every plant here in the poison garden is poisonous and has the ability to kill you. My name's Trevor Jones, and I'm the head gardener of Alnwick Garden. This plant is giant hogweed. It will get up to around about 8 foot high. It's phototoxic, so will burn your skin and give you blisters for up to 7 years. This garden is set in the wall garden of the old castle in Northumberland, UK. We would have around about 95 plants, and we're adding to the collection all the time. This plant is Aconitum, or monkshood. Wonderful blue flowers, but the whole of the plant is poisonous. The berries, crushed up and fed to you, will kill you. The leaves themselves will kill you also, as will the root and the stem. We have to obviously maintain the garden, so we have to tend the plants, and when we do that, we have to be very careful of the way we operate. So we have to cover some of our skin when we deal with particularly dangerous plants. This plant is laurel. It produces cyanide, and we all know what that will do to you. So it's the brainchild of the Duchess of Northumberland. So rather than having a herb garden, she decided to create more interest and have a poison garden. They're very, very common plants. In fact, a lot of them are what we call cottage garden plants, and they're grown in many people's gardens, but people don't know how harmful they actually are. This is a trope of belladonna. 4 berries are enough to kill a child. People are intrigued by poisonous plants, and often very worried when they come out, because many of them will be growing these plants at home. They don't realise the powerful impact plants can have on us as humans.
Is it something that you find fascinating?
Definitely.
Cool, so that's the poison garden. I just wanted to touch on a couple points that he mentioned there. So these plants are common. There's lots of them. They have lots of different ways that they're toxic to us. And there's a couple I want to talk about in more detail. So this is a trope of belladonna, which maybe you've heard of before. It's called deadly nightshade. And it contains atropine, which can be deadly. At lower doses, it can be disorienting. And it has this effect where it can cause dilated pupils. And people think that's part of how it got its name. So belladonna in Italian is pretty lady. And people used to take juice from the berries and dab it in their eyes because it was very fashionable to have those big dilated pupils. It's not safe, but it was fashionable. And so that's part of sort of the story of how this plant may have been named. And it also has some medicinal contexts where it's useful. So some eye medicines still use it because it does have that effect. So in very controlled situations, some of these toxic plants have a medicinal function. Another one that he talked about was aconitum, which is wolfsbane, and that contains aconitine, which disrupts sodium channels and makes it harder for sodium to move in and out of our cells. That can lead to muscle dysregulation, kind of tingling, numb feelings on your skin, and changes in heart function. So that one's super dangerous as well. Both of these are super toxins that affect lots of kinds of animals. And another super toxin is cyanide, which disrupts cellular respiration, and we'll get to that in a second. But so he pointed out cyanide in laurel. Actually, a bunch of plants make cyanides. Certain clovers can make some cyanide, and then Passiflora makes cyanide. And so if you joined me on the tour for the greenhouse section, we saw some species of Passiflora. These guys have a bunch of cyanide. And so they disrupt cellular respiration. Super briefly, just for like a second. Basically, cellular respiration is just a process where our cells take sugar and oxygen and get energy from that. And so that's something that lots of types of animals do, plants do it. And so something that disrupts that is super poison to lots of things because so many organisms are reliant on this function. It does this by binding a key enzyme. So the structure for cyanide is just a carbon triple bound to a nitrogen. It's not a big complex structure. And it binds cytochrome C oxidase, which if we think about the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, it gloms onto the membrane, gums up an enzyme right here. Their reaction can no longer go to completion, and we have an acute toxic effect to many things. And so what have we learned? Plants are heavily defended. They can be extremely toxic, but they still get eaten. Things can still eat these things. Herbivores that can consume these plants have to have some way to cope with these toxins that they make. And some herbivores don't just detoxify them. They can take it a step further and actually use the plant poisons for themselves. So sequestration is a process where organisms can take toxins from their food and store it in their own body for defense. There's a couple different ways they can do this. They can make special storage compartments to hold these toxins so it doesn't touch the rest of their body. They can convert it to a less toxic form, or their tissues can become less sensitive to that toxin, so they're kind of immune to where it's affecting them. And from there, it can help them not get eaten, it can help them make pheromones so they smell nice, or it can be used to protect eggs. Those are just some examples of how being toxic can help. And I want to talk about this in some groups of butterflies. So, does anyone recognize that fruit on that drink? What was it? Shout it out. Passion fruit. Yes, that's passion fruit. And passion fruit comes from the fruits of some species of Passiflora. So again, we're thinking about the plants that are here in the greenhouse. The leaves of these plants and other parts of the tissue are very rich in cyanide, and so they're very toxic and those things can't eat them. But they do have a group of specialized herbivores, the heliconius butterflies. So there's over 40 species of heliconius butterflies. These are 3 of them that are maintained in the greenhouses. And there's hundreds of species of Passiflora. And Passiflora makes cyanide, but heliconius can actually make their own cyanide-containing compounds as well. And so can some other key groups of butterflies. And it's thought that this ability of heliconius to make cyanides themselves is part of what might have let them start eating Passiflora in the first place. They already had some way in their body to stabilize and store this particular toxin. But that said, they do also sequester it from their diet. So when we think about this, we're thinking about compounds moving from leaf tissues, being maintained, staying intact, keeping that toxic function, and then staying long-term in the herbivore tissue, the butterfly, to help keep her safe. So let's look at the structure a little bit more. So this is a cyanogenic glycoside, which means it's making cyanide and stuck to a sugar. So here is the cyanide. This is a carbon triple bound to a nitrogen. Here is the sugar up on the ring. So cyanide, sugar. Being stuck on that sugar like that keeps it stable, so it's not just interacting with the body, and that's how the plant avoids having a toxic effect on itself. And the enzymes that can break these bonds that hold the cyanide to the sugar are stored in a separate compartment, so the reaction is not happening all the time. When feeding damage happens from herbivores, it crushes cells, it breaks them, and it releases those enzymes, freeing up that cyanide. Any herbivore that's not adapted to cyanide is going to have a toxic effect. So within Heliconius, there's some species that eat one or two host plants, one or two passifloras, and some that are super specialists and will eat like over 10 hosts. And these guys show different amounts of sequestering from their diet versus making their own cyanides. But what this also tells us is that many passiflora are still defending themselves against Heliconius in some way. So it's not like Heliconius can just eat every single one of the hundreds of passiflora that there are. So I want to talk to you about some different types of defense in passiflora. So they can have little egg-mimicking structures. So this picture here, this is a tendril with a little Heliconius egg on it, right? This is the butterfly egg. And a lot of species will lay just one at a time, but other species will lay big groups all together. And so some caterpillars grow up eating by themselves, but some eat as a big group, and that can help them. The plants can make these little yellow structures that kind of look like eggs a little bit, right? And if the butterfly sees those, she might be less likely to choose that plant to lay her own eggs on because it seems like someone else might get there and eat the food first. So it can reduce oviposition in that way. There's also an issue of timing where if we think of caterpillars when they first hatch, they are so teeny tiny. You might not even be able to see it, but there's one right there on my hand, so small. These guys might be a little bit easier to see. This is Heliconius sera eating all together as a group. And when the females are laying eggs, they're super picky about only picking very fresh young growth for their children, for their caterpillars. And part of the reason for this is that those leaves can expand and get tough really quickly. So here's another example of some super fresh leaves, and I'm just going to show you all of these pictures are from the same plant that are about to come. So here's the fresh leaves. As the leaves get a little bit older, you can see that they're a lot bigger. They're maybe like the size of my finger, but they're still really soft. They're still kind of shiny. It would still be okay for a little caterpillar to eat those. But they get really big and tough. Can you guys see how like rigid that is? It's kind of flat. It looks almost plasticky. That would be too big for a young caterpillar to eat. And so if a plant is going really fast, it can kind of outpace caterpillars sometimes and they don't perform as well. But some caterpillars are able to overcome this by eating in groups. When they're bigger, they can be a little tougher with those leaves. So there's also other chemicals in passiflora besides the cyanogenic glycosides. So those might be affecting passiflora and Heliconius, and this is something I'm really interested in. And we might see this through them not surviving as well, or them taking longer to mature. But if we think of the cyanogenic glycoside we looked at, here's one, and I've highlighted the little cyanide on it. But there's lots of different ways for cyanogenic glycosides to look. There's about 30 structures of these compounds just within passiflora, so that's a lot of chemical diversity. And they also make other kinds of chemicals as well, like alkaloids. So just because an herbivore can detoxify and use one thing doesn't mean they can detoxify and use everything that a plant has. And so there's still an element of chemical defense even in these really specialized systems. And so I just wanted to show you some videos. So that is Heliconius pneumata. I can tell it's pneumata because her butt is yellow. And she's walking along her plant. These are the adult stages of pneumata, and you might notice there's two different colors. The one that's flying around has a lot more yellow and orange, and the one that's staying still is just orange and black. They're both pneumata, it's just variation in the expression of color, the way that they look. And here, these are Heliconius sera, and they're all fighting to oviposit on that super fresh new shoot growth, and then one's gonna come land on my phone in a second. There she is. Yep, there she is. So that's kind of what's going on with the Heliconius, or some of it at least. There's more going on, but another interesting group is the milkweeds. So milkweeds, lots of things can't eat them. They protect themselves with things called cardenolides, which disrupt sodium, potassium pumps in our cells, and that's a broad toxin that affects lots of kinds of things. Lots of things need to be able to do that. But monarchs are specialists here. They are really good at eating milkweed and overcoming its special defenses. And so they can overcome some other defenses, like milkweed makes latex, if anybody's ever broken a milkweed leaf. If you haven't, I encourage you to, it's fun. They make these little milky secretions, and that can be toxic, but it can also kind of act like glue in their mouths and gum them up. And so monarchs will do things like cutting some of the veins of the leaves so that there's not as much pressure so that that latex doesn't come gushing out when they take a bite. And they have, in their own bodies, adapted the thing that the cardenolides act on so that they're not sensitive to it. So it's kind of like they changed their lock, right? And now when the toxin comes, it can't act on their body anymore. They also sequester cardenolides for protection, and these are some photos where someone was testing the predatory effects. So these blue jays were given monarchs to eat that had been raised on milkweeds, and as you can see, it does make the birds sick. And so the birds learn, hey, I don't like eating monarchs, I'm not going to do that again. Actually, maybe I won't eat any orange butterflies at all. And then all of the orange butterflies in the community are safer, right? There's an advantage to being orange. Okay, so going back to what interactions are important for plants, think about herbivores. Specialized herbivores have this ability to overcome extreme toxins, but plants are continuing to find ways to protect themselves in other ways against their specialist herbivores. Let's talk about another group. Let's think about pollinators for a second, right? These are our helpers. Pollinators are helping by bringing pollen around, helping the plant reproduce, and they're rewarded with food, right? The plant gives the pollinator back some food. It gives them some sugary nectar to drink in order to help move that pollen. And plants benefit from having specialized pollinators that only visit a couple kinds of plants instead of visiting every single plant in the community. So if we imagine a wildflower patch that looks like this, it's better for our species, let's say our orange flower, it's better if we can get a pollinator that's going to go from that orange flower to another orange flower that's going to be the same species without making a ton of stops along the way. Can anybody think about why that might be? Like, why not make stops along the way? What does that cost us? Yeah. What was that?
Lose some of the pollen.
You could lose some of the pollen, yeah, exactly. So the pollen needs to go to the right place. It needs to get to the right species to receive it, and if they're making lots of stops, they might be brushing some of that pollen off of their bodies onto the wrong kinds of plants. And so it's better for plants to have specialist pollinators. But how can they do that? How can they get a pollinator to act in a more specialized way? Plant traits can be adapted to specific pollinators. So when we think about pollination, we often think about bees, but other insects like moths and flies are important pollinators. Birds can be important pollinators, bats can be important pollinators. And if you notice, the shape and color of these flowers are really different from all of these types of things being visited by different animals. So shape and color and scent can all predispose the plant to being more attracted to one thing, less attracted to another. And thinking for a second just about hummingbirds, if you notice they have that really long tubular shape to their flowers, and that would fit a beak pretty perfectly, but it might stop something like a bumblebee from getting it. A bumblebee might not be able to reach the nectar, and so they might not choose to go there anymore. And the red color is really obvious to us and to hummingbirds, but bees can't see it as much. It's not as obvious of an advertisement for different kinds of animals. So it depends on the sort of the biology of which type of animal they're trying to attract. So does chemistry also lead to pollinator specialization? Yeah, it does. And we're going to look at some videos of different pollinators interacting with their plants in a specialized way that can be influenced by chemistry. So let's think about bats for a second. This is not necessarily the first group people think of when they think of pollinators, but they're really effective. They can move a lot of pollen. When they do move pollen around, they visit some plants that are of economic interest to us, like mango and durian. And a lot of bat-adapted plants have a sulfur smell to them, or sulfur-containing compounds in their sort of scent profile. And this isn't a traditional, like, nice flower smell. People wouldn't like it. It's kind of sour, it's kind of eggy. Bats love it. They really, really like it. And so having this chemical allows the flower to predispose itself to being visited by bats. So let's take a look at some bats visiting some flowers. active at night, right? We know that. Just full face. So much pollen. So that's the bats. That's something that can influence bats. There's another group that does something sort of similar, a little different. So these are orchids, right? Is where you're used to seeing them. But orchids can look lots of different ways. So these orchids are all in the genus Ophrys, and they're deceptive. So instead of offering food for being visited, these guys are being tricky. And what they're doing is they're being visited by male bees, and they're looking like female bees, while bees are just trying to find each other. They're not out looking for food. And part of that trick can involve smelling like a bee. So bees are looking for each other, the flower smells like a bee, one of the bees stops there to see what's going on and is like, oh my gosh, this is not a bee, leaves, finds another not bee, and the pollen is moved that way. And it's been shown experimentally that male bees in particular will respond really positively to these smells that are shared between the flower and other bees. So this is a really effective way to be attractive to these groups. And we can see what their pollination looks like here.
The flightless female wasp produces pheromones to attract males.
Her pheromones or her smell.
This male detects a scent that seems to be hers. Yet flies right on by.
So that's another one of those orchids.
The orchid not only has the same shape and colour as a female wasp, but it sits at the same height as she does. It even mimics her smell. And the beguiled male attempts to mate with it.
So he's visiting the flower. Keep an eye on what's going on in the back as the pollen's going to move. And we're going to see him transfer that pollen. So swivel back.
He hammers against the orchid's pollen sacs.
Pollen.
And
Yeah.
the wasp leaves, doubtless a little shaken.
So that is another example of how smell can be really effective at kind of drawing in a very particular pollinator. So scent can be important for specialized pollinators. What about generalists that visit many types of flowers? Can their preferences change? Yeah, we can think of things like coffee and tobacco plants with this, which famously make caffeine and nicotine. Caffeine and nicotine act on our nervous system, they're stimulants. They act on herbivores and humans and pollinators. So again, they're kind of our broadly acting compounds kind of deal. And at high doses, like we'd see for an insect herbivore, they're toxic. They can disrupt coordination and change feeding behavior. But at low doses, like we'd see with a person having coffee or a bee who's maybe just getting a little taste of these things and nectar, they're stimulants. And there's this idea that goes around in chemistry that the amount you have is really important for the effect you get back. So people will say dose makes the poison, or how much you have. So caffeine and nicotine have been linked to things like memory and learning for some of our really famous general pollinators like bumblebees and honeybees. Things like honeybees are more likely to remember smells when they're taught them with caffeine. Or bumblebees are better at learning color and can maintain their preferences better when they're given rewards that have dropped in quality. So how are people testing that? Like, how do you test a bee's memory, right? They can do something like this. So this is a video abstract from a study that was looking at the effects of caffeine. And they're giving a cup of sugar water. That's our pretend nectar. And some of the cups have caffeine added and some don't. And they're just looking to see if having that caffeine is leading to things like visiting more often, do they come back to look for their food source for longer? And those kinds of responses can help scientists learn about what the caffeine is doing for that pollinator. So what about seed dispersers and pathogens? This is going to be our last chemical story here. This brings us to another challenge of being stuck in place, which is how do you get your seeds new places, right? How do you stop them from just building up right beneath you. Some plants can do it themselves with things like wind dispersers or popping pods. We can think of things like dandelion or milkweeds for this. But others need seed dispersers, they need helpers. And if plants rely on animals to spread their seeds, they can reward it with food, kind of like pollinators reward with nectar. So here's some pictures of fruit. Fruit is the reward. We're dispersing seeds. So animals come and they eat fruit, seeds are now in their body, the animal is walking away, and eventually the seed will pass through their body and be in a new place. Unripe fruits are really chemically defended, and often they're kind of green in color, they don't stand out as much. If you've ever had a really awful blueberry, you've experienced this. Like they're kind of bitter, they can coat your tongue, they're not very good. And then when they're riper and they're ready, they get sweet, they get colorful, and you're supposed to want to eat them. The point is to eat them. But not all ripe fruits are sweet, right? Some things are spicy. So we can think about chili peppers. And again, capsaicin is the compound that gives them that heat sense, that gives them that kick. And we love this, but we're kind of unusual in that sense. And spiciness has a couple different functions that benefit the plant. So some species vary a lot and are only spicy sometimes and in some places, and the rest of the time they're mild. And this is thought to be related to pathogens. So when we think of our fruits here, we've mostly been talking about insects that come and they take big bites, they're chewers, this would be things like caterpillars, but some insects have little piercing mouthparts like this, and they can create just little pinpricks in the skins of fruits that then can be infected by fungal pathogens. And capsaicin, the spicy compound, is really good at protecting against those kinds of infections. They help preserve the fruit so that it doesn't spoil and get infected. And so studies have looked at like, okay, well, when are they spicy and when are they mild? And it seems like they're spicier in places where there's a greater risk of them getting infected with fungi. So this might be part of what's maintaining that heat in these peppers that we really love and have anticipated and that's, since only made spicier and spicier. So there's spicier environments that are high risk, and they have another function as well. So the hot feeling that we get is because receptors in our nerves are sensitive to capsaicin. They can respond to it, they can react to it, and this is a feature that we share with rodents. Rodents can feel the spice too, but birds are not sensitive to it. Birds, they don't feel spicy. And so birds are often pretty happy to sit and eat some hot fruit, some spicy fruit. They are more likely to get consumed by birds and less likely to get consumed by rodents. And this is extra good because the seeds that have passed through the gut of a bird are more likely to survive than the chili seeds that have passed through the gut of a rodent. And that could be because rodents are doing things like chewing. It could be something about gut acidity, but the birds are a better seed disperser, and this chemical trait helps get those fruits to the right place, to the right seed disperser. And so with capsaicin, we see protection against fungal infection and a change in how attractive we are to a good or a bad seed disperser. And that's 3 of our different interaction types, right? We've got an insect that's creating the wound, fungi can then come and capitalize on and create an infection. We've got the pathogen itself, and then we've got seed dispersers who may or may not like spiciness or be able to feel it. And so to conclude, when we think about our plant and its environment, we have lots of different tissues that are all having lots of different interactions, many relationships at play. Some of them are beneficial, some of them are harmful. A lot of them are mediated by chemistry, and chemistry can affect different kinds of relationships in different ways. We benefit from this in a lot of ways. Plant chemistry can really help us and can help with our nutrition or just be of interest or be medicinal. But many can harm us as well and be very dangerous. And we didn't talk about these 2. Does anyone recognize these? There are these? What's that one? That one is stinging nettle, which I don't know if the Massachusetts would be called stinging oak. Is it the same thing? Oh, it's the same thing. Okay, it's the same thing. Yes, yes. And then what about that one?
Poison oak.
What was it?
Poison oak.
It's poison ivy. leaves of 3. So it's good to kind of learn about some of these plants, because maybe you're like, I will never run into a Tricobelladonna, but you might run into poison ivy. And in ecosystems, these can lead to really specialized relationships for mutualists, like we see with these orchid pollination systems, or really specialized relationships with antagonists, like we see with monarchs and heliconias. And all of this goes to generate a lot of chemical diversity overall. And so with that, I'd just like to say thank you for your time. Thank you to the SUTS organizers and the facilities, and thank you to my advisors as well, as always. And I will take any questions.
Any questions? I don't want to talk too loudly. Okay. The flowers that produce that perethrin, how this becomes the insect repellent? How does that work?
Oh, I am not sure about the. Are you talking about the one, like, I think citronella, is that what it's called? We can't.
Oh, the question is the natural source that we get insect repellent from.
I'm not sure. I'm actually not sure about the exact mechanism that leads to the production of that, but if you think of what an insect repellent is probably doing, if it's a strong enough repellent that we can use it, sort of to be like, okay, I don't want insects around me, it might be having an effect on insect herbivores too, and have a defensive function in those kinds of plants. But I'm not familiar with a particular species and its exact mechanisms. Yeah.
Other questions?
Questions?
The back.
Do any of these plants create chemicals to attract humans so that we would kind of plant them more and help them spread? Or is it just organics?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think this is, and someone else might be able to correct me here, but I think that there has been some writing about that in the context of plant treaty. Oh, can't hear me. Better?
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's evolved mostly, like from the plant perspective, they just need their seed to move. So as long as it's moving, job is well done. If it has something like chilies, where like a certain type of animal is much better at moving it or helps it a lot more, then maybe there might be something like that. But there's been some interesting writing about plants that we've domesticated, things like apples, and their sweetness. Like I think sugar is the chemical that has most led to people cultivating plants, probably originally, to my knowledge at least.
Any more questions?
How long does it take for the relationship to evolve?
A long time. I would take, in general, when we think of things evolving, it's going to be on the level of many generations, but the steps involved in detoxifying something might be a while, and then losing your ability to eat whatever you were eating before, these would be pretty gradual processes. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, thank you, Fiona.
Thank you all.
One more question from Dalma.
I don't know.
What's your favorite butterfly?
Oh,
Which one?
Oh, okay. I like Pneumata, Heliconius pneumata. I also do love Heliconius sera. You may have noticed there was a little bit of a bias in the videos for those two species. I do love them a whole lot. Pneumata is easier to take care of in the greenhouses because they don't lay 50 eggs at a time. And so if you lay 50 eggs at a time and you're working in greenhouses trying to take care of things, it's easier to keep up with the ones that lay just one. Yeah. Good question.
All right. Thanks, Fiona. Before you leave, I want to quickly make some announcements about SUTS. So the first one is that the next Science Under the Stars event is going to be April 10, and will be presented by a plant biology graduate student, Yanan Bai, and she's going to tell us about how plants and lights influence each other. Not plants influencing lights, just lights influencing plants. So we also have a Wild Blitz event at the lab on April 19th. So it's a full day come and go event, and this is where you can help survey biodiversity at the research station, and then all experience level are welcome. And we also just got a restock of the new t-shirt design. So I'm actually wearing one right now. You probably can't see it very clearly, but it's a phylogenetic tree, so the tree of life, and then Earth in the middle, and stars and animals all over it. So if you're interested and want to support Science Under the Stars, please consider making a donation and grab one of the t-shirts with you. So all of our organization is completely run by graduate students, so all of the donations go into making these events happen, purchasing like trifle boards, arts and crafts supplies, and these equipment. So yeah, any donations will be greatly appreciated. And yeah, that's all we have today. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you again.